We have a brand new evidence drop from the government as they make their case in the sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs. These are new pictures from inside Combs' Miami mansion from when it was raided by federal agents in March 2024. From risque adult toys and high heels to guns, ammo, and drugs. We'll show you what they have and how it lines up with what's playing out in court in New York. We'll also tell you the shocking messages written in lipstick found on Diddy's bathroom mirror. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We have a lot to unpack because we just received dozens of pieces of evidence that the government has in their case against Sean Diddy Combs. These are pictures from the day they raided his house in Miami. Now, these appear to be what federal agents found inside that Miami mansion in March 2024. You can see some of the pictures they sent us of this mansion, just an extravagant, luxurious home on the water in an exclusive community in South Florida. Agents also raided one of Combs' homes in Los Angeles, and those raids played a key part in arresting Combs in September 2024, then getting us to the trial that is now playing out in federal court in New York. Now, this is a sketch from today as the federal agent who is in charge of the Miami raid presented pieces of evidence and testified. This is a sketch of him showing the jury one of the guns taken from the Miami house. Now, along with pieces of evidence like this, dozens of bottles of Astroglide lubricant that was allegedly used in Diddy's freak-offs that reportedly included male escorts, drugs, and his ex-girlfriend Cassie Ventura. We also have some new pictures of Ventura. This is one of her with Don Richard, who's the former Danity Kane member who testified this week that she had witnessed Combs assault Cassie multiple times. In this picture, you see Cassie on the right. Richard testified that Cassie wore glasses to hide the swelling after Combs allegedly hit her in the face. This was in New York in 2009. Other pictures show some of the injuries that the government alleges Cassie suffered at the hands of the now disgraced music mogul. We are blurring the bruises in these pictures. These are sensitive images about a sensitive topic, and also because of the rules of YouTube. Now, we see in this image here, there is a bruise on Cassie's leg. We have another picture where there's a small bruise on her shoulder. This is a picture that shows Ventura with a dark bruise that's below her waistline. All of these have been already presented to the jury. Ventura testified in court that she was the victim of years of abuse at the hands of Sean Combs. She also admitted to taking part and sometimes helping organize these freak-offs. Sometimes they were hours long. They were sex parties that involved drugs. They involved escorts. And the new evidence shows a lot of what potentially went into these sex parties. Before we get back to this story and the new evidence we have in the case against Sean Diddy Combs, I want to bring you a Law&Crime legal alert, because if you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and then you were later diagnosed with a brain or a spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients were not properly warned about this risk. It is free to check, it takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen. You can also click the link in the description or go to forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. Here's a picture of several boxes of high-heeled platform shoes that were found on the floor. You can also see, and we've had to blur them, some adult toy handcuffs and what appears to be lingerie. Next to the cuffs, you also see what appears to be AR-15 pieces, and we'll talk more about the weapons the government says that they found inside the house in just a moment. Here's a closer look at some of those high-heeled platform shoes, clear high-heeled shoes that you might see an exotic dancer wear, and you can also see the rope and another adult toy in the box as well. Now, here are some more high heels with some more adult toys nearby. The name of the adult toy, it is too graphic to say, but it appears to be an adult toy that's used for oral sex. Now, then there are several bottles of Astroglide lubricant. This came up in court multiple times this week in testimony. Diddy's former personal assistant said he would go buy Astroglide along with baby oil, condoms, and prophylactics during his time working for Diddy. Then there was the testimony of a male escort named Sheree Hayes. In his line of work, he went by the name The Punisher. He laid out what he said happened during freak-offs he was allegedly hired to be part of. He claimed that Combs entered the room in an instance only wearing what seemed like a Muslim hijab, carrying Astroglide. The Punisher said he noticed it because of the purple cap, which we do see in the government evidence photos, and he explained that it was sexual lubricant. He also said he had no communication with Combs during the freak-off as he wore allegedly that veil over his face and nothing more. The government is also submitting several images that show drugs that were seized from the house in Miami. Here's a picture of some of that evidence laying on top of a Gucci designer bag. We have had to blur a lot of the drugs because of the rules of YouTube, but I'm going to describe for you what we see. This is a picture of a Ziploc bag that has several different kinds of pills. Some of them are pink, white, blue. There's also a rolled up $100 bill right next to that bag. In another plastic bag, there are more pills. These seem to be two separate kinds as well. Some are white, some are yellow. Then there are orange and pink pills you see here that, according to the Homeland Security Special Agent who is testifying today, that's the party drug MDMA. It's similar to ecstasy. This is according to the Homeland Security Special Agent who testified today about what they saw in Miami during this raid. Now, we don't get descriptions in the evidence drops to tell you exactly what these pills are, but when it comes to drugs, Combs' former assistant, David James, testified this week that Diddy allegedly took drugs every day when he worked for him. Specifically, throughout the day, he would take Percocets and then switch to ecstasy at night. Then there is this picture. It's a small alleged container of cocaine. The government found it with a rolled up dollar bill next to it. That cocaine has a label on it that says DBL Wash. Agents also found this green locked heavy duty container. It says Diddy right across the front. And then this picture shows what it appears they found inside, which includes 2 large bags of marijuana. Along with the bags of drugs and the adult toys that agents found during this raid, they also found several weapons inside the home. Here's a picture of a handgun they found. You might remember that sketch from earlier, the special agent presenting it to the jury today. There's also a magazine and bullets that appear to go with that style of firearm. Then there are pieces to AR-15 rifles like this. The government says the serial numbers on those guns, this one with a skull and crossbones on it, have been defaced. Then there's another AR-15. That one has a biohazard logo on it. That also has a defaced serial number, according to the special agent who took the stand. A few final pieces of evidence also caught our eye. Take a look at this. These are containers of Vital Honey powder. It's a powder that's used for sexual enhancement. According to the FDA, in fact, the agency actually advised people not to buy this stuff in 2022 because it contains the same active ingredient as Cialis, which you need a prescription for. Then there is this wide picture of a bathroom in Diddy's house, and you can see what looks like lipstick or marker written on this mirror. One of the messages reads, "What do you want?" And below it reads, "Love you, love Diddy." Then there's also another message that says, "You are a legend and breathe." Combs' trial is expected to last roughly 7 weeks. He is charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now is former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern and Southern District of New York, where this case is being tried, Barrett Berger. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. There's been a lot of talk about Sean Combs' drug use over the past couple of days. What stands out to you in that testimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually turned into a pretty central part of the prosecution's case. So the allegations that make the drug use particularly relevant are that this is one way that Combs exerted control over both Cass Ventura and potentially other victims as well. We haven't heard from them yet. But part of the way that he was able to make Cassie compliant during these freak-offs, we learned this from her testimony, is through the use of drugs. So Cassie testified that for many of the freak-offs, she was high. She was given a number of different narcotics. We had other witnesses that came in and testified about seeing her, laying on a bed, appearing to be under the influence of some sort of drugs. So this was what we're seeing now is a pattern of Combs being able to, in some instances, control her through many different ways. But one of the central ways that we've heard testimony about is through these drugs.
How do you feel the government's been able to say that Cassie was more forced to take these drugs, as opposed to she lived as a someone who is in kind of the spotlight? You live that mentality where there's drugs that's always around, showing that she was actually forced to take it, as opposed to something that she just did willingly.
Yeah, and this is what the defense has really made as the centerpiece of their defense, that none of this was forced or coerced behavior. This was all, activity that she did voluntarily, that she wanted access to this lifestyle. She wanted access to his power, to the fame. And so she did these things voluntarily. I think what the prosecutors have to show is that there was not only this huge power dynamic between the two of them, right? He is this, multi-million dollar music magnate, and she is an aspiring singer who really wants to be in that orbit. There's an age dynamic. She was very young when they first started dating, but also this, elements of violence and control. So I don't think that they have to show that every time she took drugs, it was involuntary. As long as they can show that, there were certain instances where she didn't want to, or that Combs was particularly insistent on this, or that this was something that he was really pushing. So they do have to connect this to this pattern of coercion and control, but they don't have to necessarily say that every time she took drugs, it was totally against her will.
And he of course, a larger than life figure, has endless amounts of money. So in some ways, I could see someone saying it's not a surprise that he had just so many drugs in his home, as well as some of the other, baby oil's been talked about at length in this case. But were you surprised by just how much it was talked about that apparently he was regularly using substances, that he himself was someone who partook in these drugs a lot, according to people who were around him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's surprising for many of us to hear about how pervasive that was, and how much of a factor in their lifestyle this was. But, one thing that's interesting to me is it really goes to this idea of what kind of a network he had around him. He was certainly not able to get all these drugs on his own. He had assistants and guards and people that worked with him that were able to help him procure drugs on a regular basis. This is going to help the prosecutors go to one of, I think, the biggest hurdles that they're going to have to prove here, is the idea that this was an enterprise. Remember, one of the things they've charged is a racketeering conspiracy. In order for this to be racketeering, there has to be an enterprise. It can't just be one person doing this on his own. It's a little tricky when you only have one person sitting there in the defendant's chair, right? He's the only person charged right now. So it's a little hard to show that it's an enterprise. And one way that they're going to have to show that is by, drawing out people that worked for him, what they did to help advance this racketeering enterprise, including helping Combs buy these drugs that were then used both recreationally by Combs, but also to help facilitate these freak-offs.
Yeah, and it's not only just drugs. I mean, there's images that we've seen of like white powder, for example, drugs that you would assume are not legal, but then there's prescription drugs that he was able to get. And typically for folks that aren't music moguls, your doctor is not going to give you that amount of certain drugs. Cassie's testimony, from what we've heard from our reporter in the courtroom, it was incredibly raw. It was incredibly emotional. She's been described by many as the star witness in this case. What do you make of the decision to have her go? And I know she's 8.5 months pregnant, so her availability probably factors into this as well. But for her to go early in this case and kind of set the tone, as opposed to building up your case and then having her come in as somewhat of a grand finale at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was probably a decision that was part strategic and part practical. I mean, when you have a witness that is pregnant, could theoretically give birth any day, you want to make sure that you get them in before they become unavailable. Let's be honest, it also doesn't hurt their case to have a witness that is pregnant. You could tell that the defense was a little bit more cautious with her. I think they treated her with a little bit more respect and probably went a little easier on her because of the fact that she's pregnant. It's not a great look to see defense counsel beating up on somebody who's 8.5 months pregnant. So there probably was some of just the practical, let's get this in before she becomes unavailable side to the decision. But also, when I was a prosecutor, we always you want to start strong and you want to end strong. Anything that's kind of boring, troublesome, you kind of want to bury in the middle of your case. For them, Cassie's a really important witness because she can speak to, this many years of what happened during this racketeering conspiracy. She was there, with Combs and a part of his life throughout, most of the charged time period. And she can speak to a lot of the, various racketeering incidents that have been charged, but she can also give a very good overview of what he was like as a person. She testifies about the abuse. She testifies about the coercion. Through her, they're able to show this video, the CNN video showing his abuse in the hotel room. So I think she was a really important witness. I really can't imagine saving her for the end. It would be hard to kind of paint this picture without her going in the beginning.
Because I think of what she said, and yeah, she was a young girl at the time that they met. She said that she was innocent to a lot of things. She talks about doing these drugs, and then now you're hearing more about the drug use and seeing the evidence related to the drugs that, for example, was found at Diddy's house in Miami. How do you, as a prosecutor, make sure that that really emotional testimony in the beginning still holds, where a couple days later, a couple witnesses later, we're talking about the drugs, and you want to make sure the jurors remember that pregnant woman in the beginning who was so innocent that she was taking these substances?
Yeah, that's always a challenge for prosecutors. And, not only is it hard to keep sort of that emotional high going, but remember, witnesses and evidence don't always come in to a case in chronological order. It's not always a linear description of first, then this happened, then, point A to point Z. You kind of come in bits and pieces. You might have one witness who's only available to testify in a given week, so you have to call them then. So really, that's the prosecutor's job at closing argument. And we're going to see them have a huge job to put all of this together at the end of the case. And what they're going to do is try to bring the jurors back to Cassie's testimony. They'll quote from her testimony. They'll try to draw out and be like, remember when she talked about this? Remember how she sounded? So they'll have to do a good job trying to bring the jurors back to that moment. That is the challenge of having a witness like Cassie go first is, you have a 5, 6, 7 week trial. By the end of it, are the jurors really remembering everything she says? She was such a compelling witness, and I think her testimony was so emotional. You said the word raw. I think that's a good description of it. I think the jurors will remember the effect that it had on them, even if they don't remember all the specifics of her testimony. And that's then going to be the prosecutor's job at closing to bring those back into the narrative.
I think for so many of us on the outside of the world of fame, like you try to think of what it would be like if you were in those circles like Sean Combs, and then you hear about the drug use, the sex, and all of this. And then I think back to this jury, and it's like you have a social worker sitting on that jury. There's like a deli clerk sitting on that jury. What impact could just how exotic this lifestyle was have on people? Like, I think of my parents, if they were sitting on this jury, I mean, they would be blown away just understanding that any of this would be alleged to have happened in this man's life.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was a prosecutor for many, many years, and I read about the allegations in this case, and my jaw kind of drops. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that stuff's happening. And I'm somebody who I think of as having pretty thick skin with this. It's really shocking. It's hard to hear about. I imagine what the defense is really going to harp on throughout the case, but particularly when it comes to closing, is this idea that, the jurors can hate Combs. They can find this lifestyle disgusting. They can find him to be perverted, but that's not what's charged. He's not charged with being a scumbag. He's charged with being a racketeer. He's charged with being a sex trafficker. So they're really going to focus on, put aside everything you've heard about this lifestyle, try to separate that from the criminal elements. It's a hard thing to do. It's a very fine line to walk, right? I mean, jurors are people just like you and I, and it's very hard for somebody to tell us, yes, he's just a domestic abuser. He's just, somebody with this, abhorrent lifestyle, but he didn't commit these certain crimes. That's hard for jurors as it is for anybody to get their head around. So it's a pretty tricky defense, I think, to make successfully, but that's certainly the approach that they're going to take, as they, indicated during opening statements.
Right. I mean, they're saying, look, I mean, you may not like the CNN video, but that's not a smoking gun for what he's accused of in this trial. Related to the drugs, why not charge him with some drug-related offenses, considering he was taking so many of them, and there's evidence that the government has of illegal substances in his house, where I would think for a regular person, if you were found to have, for example, cocaine in your home, which, like, there's white substances that he had, that someone would face a charge, but he's not.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that for, a number of different crimes that you've seen. So for some of the offenses that have been discussed in testimony, right? Even just instances of alleged abuse. I've heard people say, well, why wasn't he just charged with assault? Number one, some of them aren't federal crimes. So here we have federal prosecutors, not state prosecutors. Some of these acts would be time barred, so they didn't come within the time period of the statute of limitations, so prosecutors wouldn't be able to bring them. Some of it may have been strategic, that we really want to keep this case focused on sex trafficking and the nature of, what these victims went through. But I'm not sure why they didn't bring some of these in. My guess is that probably if there was something obvious that they could have charged federally that they would have jurisdiction over and venue over, they probably would have. So, I'm not sure why they made that strategic decision.
And then it's important to remember, it's still early on in what's expected to be roughly a 7-week trial, and there's just been a lot to talk about each and every day. But to this point, how would you say the prosecution is doing in laying out that, yeah, Sean Combs, maybe he's a domestic abuser. We're not talking about that. Drugs, we're not talking about that. We're arguing that he was running a criminal enterprise. How has the prosecution done, in your opinion, to this point in making that argument?
Yeah, so early days still, like you said, very hard to know how the entire case is going to shape out. I imagine we'll hear from more victim witnesses. I imagine we'll see more, physical evidence that will connect all these things. But, if I had to say right now, I think the prosecution has done a very good methodical job of showing each of the elements that they need to show legally to prove sex trafficking, the prostitution, and the racketeering. I think they probably are there on the legal elements for each of these offenses. But here's the tricky part. There is still this very difficult, it's I almost want to say, like, the vibe of, a racketeering case that I'm not sure that they've convinced all the jurors that this is a racketeering enterprise. And I think that's going to be challenging for them. I think we need to hear from more people that worked for Combs, that helped assist him with some of these racketeering acts that have been charged. We need to hear more about how this wasn't just, all about him, why this was an enterprise, why it's bigger than just, the relationship between Cassie and Combs. That's, I think, what we need to see more focus on in the next few weeks. Look, they're probably there on all of the elements, and legally they probably have a facially sufficient case that they could even put forth to the jury now. But you have to do more than that. You have to be able to convince jurors that not only is this the legal thing to do, but this is actually, the moral and the right thing to do. And while they've certainly established that Combs is an awful human being, they also need to convince the jurors that these were the right charges, that this wasn't, prosecutorial overreach. And I think that's what they'll probably do and focus on in the next couple of weeks.
And even though it's not a domestic violence case, because that video is so shocking, the evidence that's being submitted showing a lot of illegal substances in his home could still, for a juror, do you find, I mean, how much of an impact does Sean Combs is a bad guy have when it comes to jury deliberations in your experience, where clearly they need to get to a point that he was running a criminal enterprise, but they could look at him through the prism of this is a bad person, and then be able to then make an easier connection than seeing someone that was a saint and then say, well, how could he run a criminal enterprise then?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In my experience, jurors have these two competing goals. They want to make sure that they are doing the right thing, in that, guilty people are held to account. I think they come into this, I really believe in the jury process, and I think most jurors come to this wanting to follow the law and wanting to make sure that if somebody is guilty, that they are, held accountable for their crimes. Similarly, they want to make sure that they don't make a mistake, that somebody who didn't commit it, you never want to be the one that sends an innocent person to jail. Here, I do think the jurors will take some solace in the fact that, however their decision shakes out, if they end up convicting him, this is not a good person. I think, jurors want to make sure that people who have done nasty things, and here there is just no dispute that Combs has done horrible criminal things. You've seen it with your own eyes through these videos. You've heard damning testimony about it from Cassie. So I think they can take a lot of solace of the fact that, whatever they do, if they convict him, it is somebody who very much will have deserved that conviction. So I think that helps. And it just goes to what I was saying earlier, the whole, yes, I'm a domestic abuser, but no, I'm not a racketeer. It might be a good defense legally. You might convince courts of that. It's a lot harder to convince 12 people who've seen evidence of how awful your client was. It's a harder job to convince them.
Yeah, and it's, we're still at the beginning of this. So it just seems like each and every day there's like a new shocking, piece of Combs' life and what he's accused of doing that comes out. We'll see how it plays out over the next 7 weeks. Barrett Berger, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law&Crime. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.